$200 million vanished from one of the oldest financial institutions on Earth, and the man responsible died in full scarlet, surrounded by incense and candlelight, while his colleagues bowed their heads over his gilded coffin. The waxy perfume of 1,000 funeral candles, the cold echo of marble underfoot, silk vestments rustling in reverent silence. Not a prison cell, not a tribunal, a Vatican funeral. But if one cardinal could quietly hollow out $200 million from the heart of the Holy See, the real question isn't how he did it. It's what kind of system has to exist first for that kind of theft to stay nearly invisible for decades. Cardinal Angelo Becciu died on December 24, 2024, and 6 weeks later the Vatican lit 1,000 candles for him anyway. The marble of St. Peter's Basilica does something particular to sound. It stretches it, smooths it, gives even an ordinary cough the dignity of a cathedral echo. So imagine what it does to a funeral choir. Imagine the incense curling toward those vaulted ceilings, the silk vestments catching the candlelight, the gilded coffin resting at the center of it all like a period at the end of a very long sentence. It was January 2025. The ceremony was full Vatican honors, the kind of ritual weight reserved for men who had served the church with distinction. Angelo Becciu had served the church, certainly. With distinction is where things get complicated. Because Becciu had also, just 3 years earlier, been convicted by a Vatican court of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of office. He was found guilty of funneling church funds into a London real estate deal that became arguably the most embarrassing financial catastrophe in modern Vatican history. He was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. He had appealed, naturally, as one does when one is a cardinal who has been caught, and he died before that appeal concluded, which meant the conviction technically stood. And yet, the candles, the choir, the incense, the marble. You have to admire the audacity of the aesthetic. What kind of institution buries its convicted criminals like saints? The question isn't rhetorical in the dismissive sense. It's a genuine puzzle worth sitting with. Because the Vatican's answer, apparently, is that baptism covers a multitude of sins, that a cardinal's dignity in death supersedes a court's verdict in life, and that the show, above all things, must go on. The incense doesn't ask questions. The marble doesn't judge. The candles burn for everyone. The scale of what Becciu was convicted of is worth holding in your mind before we go further. The London property deal alone involved around 350 million euros of Vatican funds, money drawn from the Peter's Pence collection, the donations ordinary Catholics send to Rome under the impression that it supports the poor and the Pope's charitable works. A portion of that, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million by various estimates, moved through channels Becciu controlled during his time as the Vatican's substitute for general affairs, essentially the church's chief of staff. It passed through investment funds, shell companies, real estate ventures, and at least one charitable organization run by his own brother. His brother. The audacity again. This is a story about money, which means it's also a story about power. And it's a story about the Vatican, which means it's also about centuries of cultivated mystique, the kind that makes a convicted man's funeral feel, somehow, like the most natural thing in the world. Pull up a chair. The candles are already lit. We should probably talk about how we got here. Patida sits in the mountainous interior of Sardinia, a small, wind-scraped town of shepherds and knife makers, the kind of place that produces people with patience and edges. Angelo Becciu was born there in 1948, the fifth of 9 children, into a family where resourcefulness was not a virtue but a survival requirement. The town is genuinely famous for its blades. The Patronage knife, curved and elegant, has been made there for centuries. It is, depending on who you ask, a tool or a weapon. Context, as always, determines the difference. He was ordained a priest in 1973 and entered the Vatican's diplomatic service not long after, beginning the long, quiet work of becoming indispensable. The life of a Vatican diplomat is not glamorous in the way outsiders imagine. It is residencies in places like New Zealand, Angola, Sudan, and Cuba. It is learning to read runes, to say nothing offensively, to carry the institutional position of the Holy See through conversations where the Holy See has very little actual leverage. It requires a particular kind of person, attentive, durable, and deeply comfortable with hierarchy. Becciu was apparently very comfortable with hierarchy. The Vatican's Secretariat of State, the body that manages the Church's external relations and internal operations, functions less like a government ministry and more like a very old private club. Membership is earned through decades of loyalty rather than documented brilliance. Men rise inside it slowly, the way sediment rises in still water, accumulating authority through proximity and patience rather than any single impressive act. Outsiders rarely penetrate it. Insiders rarely leave. It rewards the long game in a way that almost no other institution on earth still does, because the Vatican measures time differently than the rest of us. By the time Becciu returned to Rome for good, he had accumulated exactly what the Secretariat values most: trust, seniority, and the quiet reputation of a man who never makes scenes. Don't worry. It gets worse. Because trust in an institution like this is not just social currency. It is operational access. Access to accounts, to approvals, to the informal processes that run alongside the official ones. Decades of diplomatic postings had taught Becciu how to move through structures without friction, how to use the culture of deference that surrounds a cardinal to ensure that questions simply don't get asked. The knife maker's town produced a man who understood edges. The Vatican produced a man who understood systems. What happened when those two things combined is precisely where we are headed next. The Institute for the Works of Religion was founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII, tucked inside a medieval tower in Vatican City, managing funds for Catholic institutions and clergy worldwide. It sounds almost humble when you describe it that way. It was not humble. The IOR, as it became known, had one defining characteristic that set it apart from virtually every other bank on earth. It answered to no one outside the Vatican walls. No central bank. No financial regulator. No government audit body. The Holy See is a sovereign state, roughly the size of a golf course, and that sovereignty functioned as a kind of legal moat. Outsiders could not compel disclosure. They could only ask nicely, and the Vatican was very practiced at declining nicely. This created, shall we say, a productive environment for creative finance. The first great scandal arrived in 1982, when Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in one of Italy's worst financial disasters of the 20th century. Its chairman, Roberto Calvi, was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. The IOR was Banco Ambrosiano's largest shareholder. $1 billion had evaporated. The Vatican paid $244 million in a settlement it carefully described as not constituting an admission of responsibility. A fine distinction, a familiar one. Investigations came and went. Reforms were announced with great solemnity and implemented with considerably less. The smell of incense and the smell of offshore accounts turned out to be not entirely incompatible. Then there was Peter's Pence. Peter's Pence is among the oldest traditions in Catholic fundraising, a collection taken up annually in parishes worldwide, the faithful dropping coins and folded bills into baskets, believing they are supporting the Pope's charitable works. Elderly parishioners in rural parishes, families stretching budgets, the widow's mite. In recent years, it raises roughly $50 to $75 million annually. Here is where the irony becomes almost architectural in its beauty. The Secretariat of State maintained a separate investment fund, kept entirely off the books of official Vatican finances, funded substantially by Peter's Pence donations. This was not a charitable reserve. This was a speculative investment portfolio, including, most famously, a luxury apartment development at 60 Sloane Avenue in London, a building in one of the most expensive postal codes on earth, purchased using money that parishioners believed was feeding the poor. The absence of oversight was not accidental. It was structural. No external auditor had authority over Vatican finances. Internal oversight bodies existed on paper with the institutional power of a politely worded letter. The Secretariat of State operated its fund with a sovereignty within sovereignty, accountability to no earthly body, and apparently a fairly loose interpretation of the heavenly one. Money moved. Questions didn't. What made this system so durable was the same thing that made Becciu so effective inside it: hierarchy as insulation. Authority flowed downward, scrutiny did not flow upward, and the combination produced something that looked from a distance like an ancient institution of profound moral authority. That gap between appearance and reality is exactly where Angelo Becciu made himself very much at home. Angelo Becciu arrived at the Secretariat of State as sostituto in 2011, and with that appointment, he stepped into one of the most quietly consequential offices in the Catholic world. The sostituto is, in plain terms, the Vatican's chief of staff. The role coordinates the daily operations of the Holy See, manages the flow of information to the Pope, and serves as the central nerve of Vatican administration. Cardinals with longer titles and more ceremonial weight answer to the sostituto in practical terms. Ambassadors wait for his attention. Curial departments root their business through his office. If the Pope is the Church's head, the sostituto is the neck, and necks, as anatomists will tell you, control an extraordinary amount of movement. What the role also controlled was money. Specifically, access to discretionary funds on a scale that would make a mid-sized nation's Treasury Department uncomfortable. The Secretariat of State managed its own investment portfolio, its own reserve accounts, and its share of Peter's Pence allocations with almost no institutional friction. Requests did not require competitive tendering. Expenditures did not require external sign-off. The sostituto could authorize transfers, approve contracts, and direct funds with a speed and informality that the modern financial world had largely abandoned sometime around the introduction of audit committees. There was no audit committee here. There was deference. The culture inside Vatican bureaucracy around the sostituto was not mere professional respect. It was closer to liturgical. Junior staff did not question. Senior clergy did not press. The assumption embedded in centuries of hierarchical structure was that the man in that office occupied it because God, through proper channels, had arranged for him to be there, and one did not interrogate God's appointments. This is an extraordinary environment in which to hand someone discretionary control over hundreds of millions of dollars. Don't worry, it gets worse. Early in his tenure, patterns emerged that, in retrospect, carry the warm amber glow of warning signs nobody acted on. Becciu maintained close ties to Sardinia, his home region, with a fondness for local institutions and local figures that survived his elevation to the highest levels of Roman bureaucracy. Charitable organizations in Sardinia began receiving Vatican funds. A cooperative run by his brother Antonino received hundreds of thousands of euros in Vatican money, ostensibly for humanitarian work in South Sudan. The word ostensibly is doing considerable heavy lifting in that sentence. Patronage networks were not unusual in Vatican culture. The place had been running on personal loyalty and strategic generosity since before most modern governments existed. But Becciu pursued his with a particular enthusiasm, directing funds toward associates, toward favored projects, toward entities whose primary qualification appeared to be proximity to him personally. The marble floors of the Apostolic Palace carry footsteps very well. Beccius during this period were everywhere. Pope Benedict. Then, after 2013, Pope Francis. Two popes, the same sostituto, the same discretionary accounts, the same culture of unchallenged authority. The money that would eventually become a scandal was already moving. The architecture that made it possible had been standing for decades. And in the next chapter, it starts moving toward London. 60 Sloane Avenue, Chelsea, sits in one of the most expensive postal codes in the Western world, a short walk from the boutiques of King's Road and the quiet, obscene wealth of Belgravia. It was, in its previous life, a Harrod's warehouse. Utilitarian. Unromantic. The kind of building that stored luxury goods rather than embodying them. Someone looked at it around 2013 and saw potential. That someone was not supposed to be the Catholic Church. The path from Vatican City to a Chelsea real estate speculation ran through a Sardinian financier named Raffaele Mincione. Mincione operated a fund called Athena Capital Global Opportunities, which is exactly the kind of name designed to make money feel philosophical. Through Mincione, the Secretariat of State made an initial investment approaching $200 million, drawn from reserves that included donations from ordinary Catholics around the world. Peter's Pence. The widow's mite scaled up and routed through a Cayman Islands structure into a London property deal. The warmth of that image is not easily shaken. The arrangement was, from the beginning, expensive in ways that benefited everyone except the Vatican. Mincione charged management fees. He took performance fees. The fund's structure gave him enormous latitude over how capital was deployed, which he used, among other things, to increase the Vatican's exposure to the Sloane Avenue property well beyond what the original terms suggested. By the time the Holy See fully understood its position, it owned a substantial and illiquid stake in a development that was over budget, behind schedule, and generating no income. The air quality of the deal was, in financial terms, noticeable. Enter Enrico Crasso, a Vatican insider with ties to the Secretariat. Crasso served as a broker and intermediary in the subsequent phase of the investment, when the Vatican tried to extract itself from Mincione's fund by acquiring the Sloane Avenue property directly. This is the financial equivalent of treating a bad sunburn with a blowtorch. The transaction to buy out Mincione's position cost the Vatican tens of millions in fees, commissions, and premiums locked into contracts that seemed almost architecturally designed to transfer wealth upward toward the intermediaries and losses downward toward the institution holding the bill. The web of middlemen involved in that extraction was, in the careful language of Vatican investigators, extensive. Each node in the chain collected something: consulting fees, brokerage commissions, finder's fees with the texture of euphemism. By the time the dust settled, figures close to the investigation estimated that around 100 million euros had effectively evaporated into this network of hands, none of which belonged to anyone who had donated the money in the first place. Picture the building itself during this period. Construction delays meant 60 Sloane Avenue sat partially developed, a former warehouse in various states of becoming luxury apartments that nobody yet owned. Glass and scaffolding. The smell of concrete and damp and expensive ambition stalled in place. Meanwhile, in Rome, Becciu's secretariat continued authorizing transfers. The Vatican's exposure grew. The fees continued flowing. And somewhere in the chain, people who understood exactly what they were holding were very comfortable indeed. The surreal quality of this arrangement is worth sitting with for a moment. The Catholic Church, which has operated charitable works, schools, and hospitals across the globe on the premise of apostolic poverty and service to the poor, had become a Chelsea property speculator. Pensioners in rural Italy who dropped coins into collection baskets were, in a structurally indirect but morally direct way, funding a luxury apartment conversion in one of London's wealthiest neighborhoods. You would not design this situation on purpose. Probably. The Vatican eventually moved to sell its stake in Sloane Avenue. It recovered far less than it had spent. The development did complete eventually. The apartments exist. They are, by most accounts, very nice. Back in Rome, as the losses became impossible to fully conceal, attention began turning not just toward the deal itself, but toward the people who had approved it, blessed it, and ensured that questions arrived too late to stop anything. Which brings us back to the man in the apostolic palace, and the moment his tenure began to crack. Cecilia Morogna was, depending on who you asked, a security consultant, an intelligence broker, a humanitarian negotiator, or a woman who spent Vatican money on Louis Vuitton handbags and luxury hotel stays. The answer, as it turned out, was all of the above, with the last two items carrying rather more documentary evidence than the first. Morogna, a Sardinian like Becciu himself, entered the picture around 2017. She presented herself as a specialist in geopolitical risk, the kind of person who could quietly negotiate in sensitive regions where the church had missionaries in danger. Becciu, through a Slovak company she had established, arranged for the Secretariat of State to transfer her roughly 500,000 euros for what were described as hostage negotiation activities. The phrase "described as" is doing considerable work in that sentence. Italian prosecutors later found that a substantial portion of this money was spent on personal luxury goods, clothing, bags, hotel rooms of a quality not typically associated with backroom negotiations in active conflict zones. Imagine trying to explain that expense report. The receipts, presumably, were atmospheric. The Morogna case was almost quaint compared to the London property catastrophe, and that smallness is precisely the point. Becciu did not limit his generosity to dramatic international financial schemes. He applied it closer to home, with a warmth that investigators found touching in all the wrong ways. His brother, Antonino Becciu, known as Tonino, ran a cooperative called Spaes in the Sardinian Diocese of Ozieri. Between roughly 2012 and 2019, the Vatican Secretariat of State and associated charitable funds channeled around 100,000 euros toward this cooperative in the form of grants framed as humanitarian assistance. Tonino's organization did operate social services. Whether those services required that particular level of Vatican attention from that particular cardinal is the sort of question that answers itself. Another brother received separate Vatican funds. Further associates and intermediaries received loans from church accounts, some of which were repaid in ways that raised more questions than the loans themselves. The pattern was consistent and, once visible, almost mundane. A charitable envelope here, a consulting arrangement there, a contract extended to someone who happened to share a surname or a history. What Becciu had constructed was not a single conspiracy, but something more organic and in some ways more troubling. A patronage culture, the kind that has existed in institutions since institutions existed. The difference was the source. This was not a politician distributing government contracts to loyal supporters. This was Peter's pence, the charitable contributions of ordinary Catholics worldwide, being quietly redirected toward a network of people whose primary qualification was proximity to one man in the apostolic palace. The sums involved at this level were small compared to the London disaster. But the London disaster required complexity, intermediaries, and a functioning international property market. The patronage machine required nothing except access and the assumption that nobody would look carefully. Someone eventually did look. And the picture that emerged was of an institution whose charitable funds had become, in one corner, something uncomfortably close to a private account. Which raises a reasonable question about oversight. Who was supposed to be watching? And what were they actually doing instead? The Church has a word for buying spiritual favors with money. It is called simony, after Simon Magus, who offered the apostles cash in exchange for the power of the Holy Spirit and received, in return, a fairly stern letter from Peter. The practice was so common by the medieval period that Dante placed Simonists upside down in burning holes in hell, feet on fire, which tells you both how seriously the Church took the offense and how often it apparently needed reminding. Cardinal Becciu, prosecutors alleged, had discovered a modern variation on the theme. Among the diversions of Vatican funds under investigation was money directed toward the beatification cause of Antonia Maria Lacconi, a Sardinian Capuchin friar from Cagliari who had died in 1912 and whose path towards sainthood had been moving through Vatican channels with, allegedly, some financial encouragement. Becciu's home island was Sardinia. Lacconi was a Sardinian figure of local devotion. Prosecutors alleged that funds had been channeled to support this cause in ways that entangled spiritual process with financial patronage. Beatification is supposed to be the Church's most rigorous accounting of holiness. It is not supposed to involve anything resembling a budget line. Here is what makes this accusation theologically devastating, beyond the obvious embarrassment. The Church does not sell sacraments. It does not sell grace. The entire Protestant Reformation, in significant part, exists because a German monk named Martin Luther watched the Church sell indulgences in 1417 and concluded that something had gone structurally wrong. The Church spent the next several centuries explaining that it understood this, that the abuses had been corrected, that the institution had examined its conscience thoroughly. A cardinal allegedly steering funds toward a beatification cause in his home region is not quite selling indulgences. But it is standing very close to the same fire, wearing flammable clothing. The broader Vatican culture of financial gifts, the charitable grants that blur into influence, the donations that arrive alongside requests, had existed long before Becciu. Observers of the Curia have noted for decades that the line between generosity and leverage in that environment can become, in polite terms, negotiable. What made the beatification allegation different was its target. Not property investment, not a brothers' cooperative. The sacred machinery itself, the formal process by which the Church declares someone to be in heaven, had allegedly been touched by the same hands that signed the London wire transfers. Even the Borgias, that Renaissance benchmark for ecclesiastical excess, mostly confined their corruption to the political and the carnal. They generally left the theology alone. Which brings us to the trial itself and what happened when the Vatican decided to prosecute its own. In September of 2020, Pope Francis summoned Cardinal Angelo Becciu to the Apostolic Palace and asked for his resignation. No press conference. No formal announcement. Just a private meeting in which the most powerful office in Christendom looked a senior cardinal in the eye and said, in effect, that the accounting had not added up. Becciu resigned the same day. The Vatican's Internal Audit Office had been working quietly since around 2018, pulling at the threads of the Secretariat of State's investment portfolio with the careful energy of people who suspected what they might find and were hoping to be wrong. The London property deal, which had consumed hundreds of millions of euros of Peter's Pence funds in a Chelsea building that turned out to be spectacularly overvalued, kept producing new numbers. The numbers kept getting worse. By 2020, Vatican auditors were looking at losses they could not reasonably attribute to market conditions alone, and investigators were looking at people they could not reasonably investigate without consequences. The consequences arrived in that September meeting. What made Francis's confrontation with Becciu extraordinary was not simply that it happened. It was what came next. Within hours of the resignation, Francis did something the modern Vatican had essentially never done. He stripped Becciu of his rights and privileges as a cardinal, while Becciu was still living, still in Rome, still insisting loudly that he was innocent. Cardinals, historically, do not lose their cardinalates. The red hat is not a job title. It is closer to a permanent state of being, like ordination. Francis stripped it anyway. Or rather, stripped the privileges attached to it, which is technically a distinction, and practically, for a man of Becciu's generation and formation, something close to annihilation. Becciu did not take this quietly. He appeared before reporters the same day, visibly shaken, and said he accepted the resignation with pain in his heart, but firmly denied wrongdoing. This was not the curial silence that Vatican insiders typically employ. This was a cardinal making a public scene, and the old guard found it alarming, though which part alarmed them more, the alleged crimes or the public emotion, varied somewhat by observer. Francis had been pushing financial reform since taking office in 2013. The Vatican bank scandals, the off-book accounts, the culture of institutional opacity that had accumulated across decades, these were exactly what he had promised to address. He had created new oversight bodies, installed lay financial experts, delivered speeches about transparency with the weary regularity of someone who knew the speeches were necessary and doubted they were sufficient. The Becciu case became the test he had not exactly requested. Prosecuting a sitting cardinal through a genuine Vatican criminal process, with evidence and witnesses and a courtroom, meant dismantling the fiction that the institution could always manage these things quietly, internally, without the indignity of accountability. It meant trading the Church's reputation for managing problems for the Church's reputation for actually solving them. Those are, as Francis understood very well, two very different reputations to hold. The trial that followed would test exactly which one the Vatican was willing to be. The trial opened on July 27, 2021, in a converted courtroom inside Vatican City, a space roughly the size of a modest conference room in a country the size of a golf course. 10 defendants. Hundreds of thousands of pages of financial evidence. 3 lay judges, none of them clergy. And a legal code that had, until very recently, not technically permitted any of this to happen. That last detail deserves a moment of appreciation. Vatican criminal law, as it existed before Francis intervened, had been written for a different kind of problem. Petty theft, perhaps. A dispute over a boundary wall. Not a transnational real estate fraud involving shell companies in Luxembourg and a broker from the Cayman Islands. The prosecutors who opened the case in 2021 were working with tools built for a different era, and they knew it, and so did the defense. Francis solved this with a decree, then another decree. Partway through the pretrial process, he issued a series of papal edicts that effectively rewrote the Vatican's legal procedural rules in real time, allowing prosecutors to subpoena financial records from the Secretariat of State that had never previously been subject to external examination. The defense teams argued this was irregular. They were not wrong. The Pope had literally changed the rules of the game after the game had started. In any other jurisdiction, this would be a scandal. In Vatican City, it was a Thursday. The defendants made for an unusually varied parade. Cardinal Becciu sat at the center of it, silver-haired and aggrieved, maintaining throughout that he had acted in good faith and had been made a scapegoat for the institutional failures of others. Raphael Mincioni, the London broker who had guided the Secretariat's money into the Chelsea property, appeared as a man who believed sincerely that his financial acumen had been misunderstood. Cecilia Maronia, the so-called Lady of the Cardinal, who had received 800,000 euros in transfers through her Ljubljana-based company for purposes that remained creatively described throughout the proceedings, offered explanations that the court found, to put it gently, incomplete. The testimony was dense, technical, and frequently surreal. At one point, proceedings stalled for months over questions about whether Vatican law required a different burden of proof than had been applied. Defense attorneys filed objections in a system that had not previously processed objections of this kind, to judges who were consulting legal scholars to determine how to respond, in a courtroom that lacked the physical space to seat all the parties comfortably. The air in there must have been extraordinary. Financial crime is difficult to prosecute anywhere. Juries struggle with spreadsheets. Judges struggle with offshore holding structures. Vatican judges, working from a criminal code that had been substantially improvised in the preceding 2 years, struggled with essentially everything. But they continued. The trial ran for more than 2 years, accumulating testimony and evidence with the grinding patience of an institution that has, after all, been conducting its business across centuries. The verdict arrived in December of 2023. Angelo Becciu was found guilty of embezzlement and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. Mincioni received a 5-year sentence. Maronia, 3.5 years. Several other defendants received convictions on related charges. A few were acquitted. Becciu announced immediately that he would appeal, calling the verdict unjust and reaffirming his innocence with the conviction of a man who has been maintaining the same position for 3 years and is not prepared to stop now. The Vatican issued no particular fanfare. The trial had been messy, complicated, and frequently embarrassing for an institution that prefers its authority to feel eternal and its processes to appear serene. But it had happened. A cardinal had been convicted of a crime in a real court, with real judges, and a real sentence. Whether the sentence would ever truly be served was, of course, a separate and rather interesting question. Which brings us inevitably to what happened next: the funeral. 5.5 years, plus an €8,000 fine. For €200 million in losses, a Chelsea property debacle, shell companies, ghost consultants, and enough questionable wire transfers to fill a moderately sized thriller novel. To be fair, Angelo Becciu did not go to prison. He went home, to Rome, where he continued to reside in reasonable comfort while his legal team prepared an appeal, which in Vatican terms means an appeal to the Vatican Court of Appeals, staffed by Vatican-appointed judges, operating under Vatican procedural rules inside the same Vatican that had already found him guilty. The conflict of interest there is, let us say, atmospheric. The contrast is worth sitting with for a moment. The ordinary Catholic faithful who contributed to Peter's Pence, the charitable collection that helped fund some of these investments, had no appeals process. Their donations left their hands and entered a system they trusted. The pensioner in Palermo who dropped an envelope in the collection basket in 2017 was not offered a review hearing. She just gave her money to a fund that would, at least in part, find its way toward a London luxury apartment that nobody particularly needed. Becciu maintained his innocence with impressive consistency. Every interview, every statement, every carefully worded press release carried the same essential message. He had acted in good faith. He had been wrongly accused, and history would vindicate him. History has heard this before and tends to reserve judgment. The Vatican, for its part, moved on with the quiet efficiency of an institution that has processed scandals across multiple centuries and developed extremely effective mechanisms for not dwelling. The conviction was real. The sentence was real. The enforcement of that sentence, given Becciu's age, his health, his appeal, and the Vatican's evident preference for institutional dignity over punitive spectacle, remained theoretical. Which raises the honest question about what Vatican justice is actually built to do. Accountability is expensive, disruptive, and unflattering. Appearance is manageable. A trial can be both genuine and essentially decorative at the same time, particularly if the outcome produces headlines without consequences. Whether that describes this outcome is something each viewer will have to decide personally. Becciu filed his appeal. The Vatican judicial machinery turned, slowly, as it tends to. And in the interim, life continued with a certain undisturbed quality for the convicted cardinal. Then, in January of 2025, Angelo Becciu died. And the Vatican, in its infinite consistency, gave him a funeral. The candles were lit. The marble gleamed. The incense rose in slow coils toward a ceiling that has witnessed over the centuries the funerals of saints and scoundrels and a remarkable number of people who were somehow both. Angelo Becciu died in January of 2025, and the Vatican gave him the full treatment. Cardinal's vestments. Solemn rites. The dignified procession of clergy in silk and white linen, moving through spaces so beautiful they make grief feel like an aesthetic experience. Bells. Prayers. The whole ceremony conducted with the kind of serene institutional gravity that the Church has spent 2,000 years perfecting. He had been convicted of embezzlement 18 months prior. This was apparently not a disqualifying detail. The Vatican's justification was tidy, and in its own way, admirable for its confidence. A cardinal is a cardinal. The sacramental dignity of holy orders is not revoked by a criminal conviction. The office outlasts the scandal. And so the Church honored the office, as it always has, as it always will, while the inconvenient man inside it was quietly absorbed into the ceremony and buried beneath the weight of tradition. Which is, if you squint at it in the right light, a masterclass in institutional laundering. Not of money this time. Of legacy. Consider what the optics communicated to the watching world. A man convicted of redirecting charitable donations, of defrauding an institution built on the faithful's trust, of presiding over a financial apparatus that consumed the Peter's Pence contributions of ordinary Catholics across the globe, received every honor the Church could offer at the moment of his death. The silk. The marble. The candles casting warm gold light across a ceremony that smelled of sanctity and, if you were paying close attention, something else entirely. Compare this, if you will, to the experience of the ordinary Catholic navigating church doctrine. Divorce without annulment and you are barred from communion. Miss Mass on a Sunday without sufficient reason and you have technically committed a mortal sin. The Church maintains a remarkably detailed ledger for the faithful, with precise entries for infractions both large and small. The pastoral machinery for accountability turns with considerable efficiency when the sinner is in a pew. When the sinner is in a red hat, the machinery develops, let us say, a certain flexibility. The message received by the global Catholic community was not subtle. Institutions protect their own. Rank confers not just privilege in life but immunity in death. The ritual is not disrupted by the verdict. The ceremony continues because the ceremony is, in the end, what the institution is actually for. Somewhere in Palermo, presumably, the pensioner who dropped her envelope in the collection basket in 2017 heard about the funeral. One hopes she found it edifying. The incense finished its slow climb toward the vault. The prayers concluded. The Cardinal was buried with full honors, and the Vatican resumed its operations with the unruffled composure of something that has survived emperors, reformations, and financial audits. Which brings us at last to the question the entire story was always building toward. What does any of this actually change? Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in June of 1982, his pockets stuffed with bricks and cash. His death ruled a suicide by authorities who, it must be said, were working with a creative definition of the term. He had been known as God's banker. His institution, Banco Ambrosiano, had funneled hundreds of millions of dollars through Vatican-linked shell companies before collapsing in the largest bank failure in Italian history to that point. The Vatican Bank denied involvement. Paid a settlement anyway. $1,240 million, quietly, with no admission of wrongdoing. The architecture of opacity held. That was 40 years ago. Don't worry. It gets worse. The Vatican Bank scandals of the 1970s and 80s produced hand-wringing, promises of transparency, and a sequence of reforms that arrived with great fanfare and departed with considerably less. Pope Francis, to his genuine credit, launched a new wave of financial oversight after his election in 2013. He established a secretariat for the economy. He brought in external auditors. He created structures that looked, from the outside, like accountability. And yet, the Peter's Pence Fund, the charitable collection at the center of the Becciu case, still does not publish a full accounting of where its money goes. Hundreds of millions in annual donations from the faithful sit in a category that might charitably be called allocation undisclosed. The reforms created better paperwork. The money remained where it has always been, which is to say, somewhere unspecified. There is a version of this story in which Becciu was a rogue actor, an exceptional case, the bad apple the institution needed to expel to demonstrate its seriousness. This version is comfortable, and the Vatican would very much prefer you to believe it. There is another version, less comfortable, in which the opacity was never an accident, in which a system that conceals its flows, resists external audit, and clothes its financial operations in the moral authority of sacred mission is not a system that was corrupted. It is a system that was designed. You may recognize the structure. Enron reported its own health for years while its internal accounting became a work of avant-garde fiction. FTX positioned itself as a force for good, a crypto enterprise with charitable ambitions, right up until the moment its customers discovered their funds had been, let us say, relocated. The pattern is consistent across centuries and industries. Institutions that generate their own moral authority create their own audit immunity. The church that feeds the poor does not expect to be asked what happened to the receipts. Becciu was convicted. He was also given a cardinal's funeral. The Vatican's financial reforms are ongoing. The full accounting of Peter's Pence remains unavailable. The Banco Ambrosiano settlement is 40 years old, and the Vatican Bank is still operating. The question the story keeps asking, quietly beneath all the incense and ceremony and red silk and marble, is not whether Angelo Becciu was guilty. A court already answered that. The question is how an institution builds a 500-year tradition of financial opacity, and whether one conviction, however dramatic, is enough to interrupt it. History on this point is not encouraging.